Oh, just short, my name is Henning Obens. A very warm welcome to you in the room and at home, and very welcome also Grace Blakeley. She couldn't be here with us tonight, unfortunately, just in short notice, but we'll try to make the best of it, and thanks a lot to our event management that they prepared to have you here now on screen. And thank you very much, Pauline, for introducing, under these circumstances, our talk with Grace. And thank you all for coming here. Who needs translation? Outside there will be interpretation machines. And I wish you all having a good evening in this beautiful spring evening in Berlin. And have a good discussion with Grace, and we're interested what you'll tell us. So the floor is yours, Pauline, and just two sentences to you. You're a journalist and author, and she's with the Taz at the moment. And we had some very good talks with Pauline here, and so very warm welcome also to Pauline. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Also, very warm welcome from me. Thank you for joining us tonight, even though we have a very good weather outside. That's probably the reason why there are not as many people here as said will be here. But thanks for joining, especially in that circumstance. As many of you probably know, this event is part of a series called Linksbündig that Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung hosts, where new left books are introduced. And tonight we have the honor of talking with a very special guest, the wonderful author and Marxist economist Grace Blakeley, about her book Vulture Capitalism, which is not new. It was published last year in 2024 in English, but what is new is the German edition, which was recently published, and tonight is the premiere of that German edition. Just a few words about Grace Blakeley. She's born in 1993. She's a British author, journalist, and commentator. She studied philosophy, economics, and politics at the University of Oxford. And she's one of the most well-known critics of capitalism at the moment. And her book, Vulture Capitalism, as I already mentioned, so the full title is Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and the Death of Freedom, was published in March 2024. And the reason why we're here tonight is that it's now published in German, and of course the relevance of the book and its content in the current context we're in. In German, it has a very different title. The title is Die Geburt der Freiheit aus dem Geist des Sozialismus, wie das Kapital die Demokratie zerstört. So in English, that's the birth of freedom from a spirit of socialism, how capitalism destroys democracy. And it's published by Tropen Verlag just now. So a few words about how this event is going to go. First, it's going to last for 2 hours, and first we're going to be talking a bit, just the two of us. We're going to be discussing the central ideas of the book, and then we're going to have around 45 minutes to an hour to open the discussion to you guys, so you can also ask questions and enter the discussion with Grace. Before we actually dive into the book, Grace, I want to ask, what's the audience that you imagined to be your readers when you wrote the book? Because especially reading the first few pages and the introduction, it felt like you weren't aiming to reach your typical econ nerd with your book.
No, I was really trying to reach quite a broad audience. When I wrote the book, I think whenever you write a book, you have to have a very clear idea about what you want to do with it. Because you can't just be like, I'm really interested in this subject and I'm going to write about it in the way that I want. And when I wrote this book, my ambition was to change the way that people think about capitalism. right? And so that implies I'm speaking to people who have a sense of what capitalism is, so they're kind of engaged and informed readers, but they don't have maybe like necessarily a specialized knowledge, or indeed they do have a very clear opinion about what they think capitalism is. And I'm trying to challenge that by bringing in this alternative perspective, which, as you say, is not this Marxist perspective, basically, which is not something that you hear in the mainstream very often at all. If anything, you know, the term Marxist is used as an insult or as a kind of way of dismissing someone. So I really wanted to bring back this Marxist critique of capitalism, which sees the system as a particular, is based on particular relations of production. So, you know, the Marxist perspective really forces us to come back to the production process, the classes that emerge in that production process, how that affects politics, how that affects society, but, you know, not just thinking on the one hand, like ideas shape the whole of history, or, you know, everything that happens within society comes from cultural change, or indeed that free markets are what define capitalism. Instead, looking at how we produce things, which brings you back to this hierarchical relationship between the people who own all the stuff that is required to produce everything in society and everyone else who is forced to work for a living, studying that relationship between owners and workers, and then seeing how that relationship affects our politics as well. So how does the way we produce things, how does the way the corporation works, how does the way finance works affect our politics? And that's really the perspective that I wanted to bring in. And yeah, those are the kinds of people that I wanted to talk to, anyone who thinks they know what capitalism is.
Great. Perhaps that's just my impression, but I feel like there's been kind of an increase in attention for and demand for left perspectives on economic policy and economics in general. Do you agree with that? And why do you think is that the case?
I think that if you went out into the street right now and asked a random selection of people, do you think the economy is working? Do you think democracy is working? Do you think our society functions effectively? The vast majority of people would say no. There is, to an extent that I've never seen before, probably in my life, and I think that we haven't seen in many years, a broad consensus that the way we manage our economy, the way we manage our society, the way we manage our politics is completely and utterly broken. And people are crying out for an explanation as to why that is. And the left explanation for that is the one that I think is really the most convincing and the most compelling. You know, liberals basically believe that everything's fine, that the system is working, and that at best we just need to, you know, convince people that actually it would be in their interests to continue things as they are, and that they just don't understand that the policies that those at the top are implementing are good for them. And then on the right, the explanation is basically that a kind of liberal elite has taken away your freedoms by forcing you to live alongside immigrants, and that the only way to deal with these problems is to, you know, get rid of the decarbonization agenda, get rid of migrants, and restore the authority of patriarchy and all of these kind of historic conservative ideas, which I don't think is a compelling explanation or response to this crisis, which leaves you with the left alternative. And I think actually, you know, even relatively conservative commentators on the right tend to take from the left's talking points. You know, there's the critique of globalization and free markets, the critique of concentrated economic power, the critique of a lack of accountability. But all of those critiques that the left has developed and has been talking about for many years, you know, if we're talking about the critique of globalization, that goes back to the protests at Seattle, which were organized by the left, the anti-globalization movement. We've been saying this for decades, and now that's been co-opted and warped and changed by the right. But if you really want to understand the system, you have to go back to that source, to that original criticism of capitalism. And that's the only place you're really going to get that is from the left.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I feel like even liberals at this point have kind of recognized that things are not working out the way they wanted it to, especially when it comes to the climate crisis. I think they are realizing what's happening. I had this very interesting moment recently where this a liberal journalist came to talk about kind of the rise of fascism and what we need to do against it. And interestingly, he argued that what the left needs to be doing is protecting neoliberal ideas against fascism, because that's the only way we could save this world. Interestingly enough, of course, he didn't kind of realize or think about the fact that it is exactly that kind of neoliberal system that has led us to the moment we're at. And maybe you could talk a bit about that moment we're at, the context in which you wrote the book and that you tried to intervene into the current economic situation, both globally but also nationally. You write in your German book, you write an introduction about the kind of current German situation, but also you, of course, as a British person, you write about Great Britain.
Yeah, so, if we're trying to understand this particular moment, then you have to recognize that the defining emotion in politics today is disempowerment. People feel like they don't have any control over their lives. They feel insecure when it comes to their incomes, when it comes to their work, and that is because the economy is insecure, because people are on less secure contracts, they don't have as much union recognition, and those unions aren't as militant when it comes to demanding good wages. They don't have the kind of security in their employment that they once had in the past. They don't have the security of relying on strong public services that they can rely on if things go wrong. There's lots of problems when it comes to people's security of tenure, when it comes to, and fundamentally people do not trust that politicians represent their interests, which I would say is true. They're right not to believe that the vast majority of politicians really care about the interests of working people. So there's this sense that, as I mentioned already, the economy isn't working, society isn't working, the system is rigged, so there isn't really very much you can do about it as an individual. And that generates this real sense of disempowerment, of that everything's broken and there's nothing I personally can do about it. And I think there are basically two ways that you can respond to that realization. The first is basically despair. And I think that's much more prevalent on the left. You see it particularly among younger people now who are just they have severe climate anxiety because they're there's absolutely nothing we can do to stop climate breakdown and the world is just screwed. I see this all the time. People just being the world is broken, there's nothing we can do about it, everything's gone completely wrong. Then on the right, the other way you can respond to this is rage. And this is a classic response to that feeling of my power has been taken away from me, that is completely understandable from a psychological perspective. If you feel like you're being oppressed or, prevented from acting in a particular way, a response to that is just to lash out and just to be I am going to kind of put on a mask of dominance and of anger to really push back against this system that has been oppressing me or that makes me feel like I don't have any power. It's a way of kind of exerting your agency to say, oh, I'm taking back control over my life, right? And that plays out in very different ways today in modern politics. You saw this very clearly with, take back control being the narrative of the Leave campaign in the UK. You see it, make America great again. People kind of projecting their sense of disempowerment onto a political figure who they see as strong, someone who's capable of kind of taking down the system, even if they don't fundamentally believe that someone like Trump will actually make their lives better. They don't have to. That's not the point. The point is that they're so angry about this sense that they have no power, that they're willing to support someone purely because that person embodies a sense of power and agency and control that they feel like they've lost. And I think there's a very interesting parallel here with the origins of fascism, because in Italy, Mussolini was originally a socialist, and his whole theory around the development of fascism drew on this Roman imagery of the fasces, which was a weapon. It was a bundle of sticks tied together with an axe coming out of the middle. And the whole idea of the fasces was that you could break one stick very easily, but if you bundled those sticks together, it was very hard to break that bundle. And actually you could use that to attack other people. And this was the idea of like strength in numbers, right? If you came together and built a powerful political movement, you could use that collective power to fight back against your enemies, to defend your community, to defend yourself, and to make you feel strong. That sense of like, you know, coming together to defend your interests has always been a key part of fascism. But in another way, it's also a key part of socialism. Because if you think about the metaphor that unites the labour movement, it's the raised fist. Why is it the raised fist? Because you can break one finger very easily, but when you put them together, it's much harder to break a full fist. That's a similar sort of narrative. And Mussolini took that and warped it into this fascist ideology, which was to say, you, the worker, are being screwed over. So we all need to come together and fight back. But the enemy is never really articulated. It's never like, you know, these people at the top have made your life worse through these policies. There's always just a sense of find someone weaker than you and fight them to make yourself feel more powerful. And that's what we're seeing now with the rise of the far right.
And what's your understanding of why it is that the right wing is so much better at capitalizing on this moment of despair, this widespread despair and fear and hopelessness? Why are they so much better at it than the left apparently is?
This, I think, is a function of the shifts that we've had in the last several years. The last several decades. Because neoliberalism was really about creating a society in which every single person feels completely isolated, completely alone, and completely unable to form those kinds of collectives that would be able to defend themselves, right? So when Margaret Thatcher comes to power, her first real aim is to crush the labour movement, is to crush the biggest source of collective power in the British economy. It's the same with Reagan. They crush the labour movement, they crush community movements that are trying to resist their policies at the local level, they crush protest movements that try and fight back, and they build this society which is based on the idea of competitive markets. Now, as I argue in the book, the economy doesn't function according to this competitive market logic. The neoliberals build an economy in which corporate power is protected and merged with political power. So you have a kind of oligarchic system where political and economic power are fused in service of the interests of the very top. Basically, those at the top collaborate. They learn how to work together to defend their interests. But for everyone else, the ideology of the free market is rigidly enforced. You have to compete to survive. You have to compete with your fellow workers to get a higher wage. You have to compete with those around you to kind of have a sense of self-esteem. You know, today this is epitomized with social media, you having to compete to build a personal brand and get as many likes as possible. Equally, the idea that you are solely individually responsible for all of the risks that happen to you over the course of your life, that is something that's deeply embedded with neoliberalism. You know, you have your own private pension, you have your own house with a mortgage, assets and liabilities that you have to manage on your own. The safety net that would have protect you when things gone wrong, that's gone. It's up to you to protect yourself. Nobody's going to have your back if things go wrong. And this really developed with the whole idea of the kind of asset-owning society, the home-owning society, in which we were all kind of isolated in our little bubbles. We were no longer workers. We were entrepreneurs. We were mini-capitalists. We were no longer citizens. We were consumers of public services. And we were no longer communities. We were households.
Yeah.
And we were all encouraged to compete against other households to get to the top, basically.
Yeah.
And that, alongside the active assault on the trade union movement, is what has given us this highly isolated, highly individualized society in which the average person cannot imagine what it would be like to cooperate with those around them to resist the power of those at the top. They can't imagine what it would be like to form a union, to get involved in community organizing, to form a tenants union, to really have those bonds that allow us to protect each other. And it's that isolated, individualized, powerless society that the far right has entered and said, I know you feel powerless, and I know that you feel like there's nothing you can do and that no one has your back. So rely on me, the big, strong man, and I will defend your interests.
Right, and what you're saying, I think, could be divided in two parts. One part is kind of the economic necessity under capitalism to fight your own fight, right? But the other thing is also ideology, right? And how ideology plays into it. The neoliberal ideology that growing up in that system, I can talk about myself, we kind of were taught that this isn't ideology at all. This is just kind of the free society just functions like that naturally. And I think one of the strengths of your book is that you intervene into some of these big narratives that we all take for granted. And I think the most central argument you make, or that you start your book with, you begin with this critique of this core neoliberal narrative, which goes capitalism equals free markets. It's good, it means freedom for all of us. And then socialism is the centralized planned economy that's probably authoritarian. And before we get into that critique further, maybe we could talk about what is economic planning, the way that you understand it, in difference to a free market dynamic.
Yeah, sure. So, the central thesis of vulture capitalism is that capitalism is not really a free market system. It's certainly not really a free market democratic system that we're used to hearing. And on the other side of that, socialism is not, as people claim, defined by kind of centralized state planning of the kind that you would have seen in, say, the USSR. And this is the kind of division between like a free market, decentralized system and a centrally planned state socialist system, as one between capitalism and socialism, that's been held up throughout history. It's held up in our politics and economics as between these two very clearly defined systems. There's like the capitalist free market with overtones of kind of liberalism, the end of history, the people who are on the right side of the fight between East and West. And then socialism is seen as this kind of dead, rigid, archaic ideology defined by centralized planning that isn't really fit for the kind of dynamism of modern societies. And you see echoes of this today even within our own politics, because the divide between left and right is constantly seen as this battle between people who want a small state, lots of space for the free market, and people who want a big state and to contain the dynamism of the free market. And that's basically completely wrong, that divide. That's not what capitalism is. Capitalism is not a free market system that requires a small state. It is a system defined by massive monopolistic corporations that dominate the world economy and have nothing to do with free markets. And those businesses are able to undertake a significant amount of centralized planning, the thing that we're told defines socialist societies. The world economy is also not defined by small states. Everywhere now, over the course of the last several decades, indeed over the course of the history of capitalism, a recurrent theme is big states stepping up and intervening to support the interests of those big monopolistic corporations. Today we're living in this era of Elon Musk working with and through the American state. These almost kind of hegemonic forces working together to pursue a particular idea of what constitutes the interests of the US. And I argue that that is not an aberration. That's actually a defining feature of capitalism, all the way back to the East India Company, which was this joint venture between the British state and British merchants, that link between huge monopolistic corporations and their guardians within powerful capitalist states. That is the defining feature of this system. But still, most people, when you ask them, consider capitalism to be this kind of free market system. And historically, we've had this, as I said, opposition that was epitomized during the Cold War with the battle between the US and the USSR. And this narrative is just like really embedded within our societies. Capitalist societies are these nice democratic free market systems where the production of resources is decentralized, the market gets to decide everything, and any kind of big corporations are held to account within democratic institutions.
And what's
but that
the
model? Sorry, Karen.
So what do you think is the purpose of this narrative? I think you talk about Hayek, right? One of the founding fathers of neoliberalism as we know it today. And you talk about his notion of freedom as kind of the main goal or end of a free market economy.
These questions around freedom and... So, are you going to...
Yeah, sorry.
Did you want to ask more? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So, sorry. Now I lost my train of thought. So you critique Hayek for his notion of freedom, and my question was, what do you think is the purpose of this narrative? That Hayek was right. He was one of the people who spread this narrative that free market capitalism means freedom for all. But you also explain how that wasn't really what he thought, or that wasn't really his intention at all.
Yeah, so the whole narrative of freedom and a small state and free market capitalism was really important because this was basically part of the lie that we were sold, particularly during the 1980s, with neoliberal governments, right-wing governments really, like those of Thatcher in the UK, Reagan in the US, Pinochet in Chile. They came to power. And they would, according to the neoliberal philosophy, create these lovely free markets that would distribute resources efficiently, that would promote human freedom, that would promote competition, and that would make everyone better off. And this was a narrative that those of us on the left have always pushed back against and said, there are problems with organizing society just according to the free market. It creates crisis. It, creates lots of different problems. But what I've talked about in the book is that we're not criticizing the reality. We're criticizing the ideas that were presented to us. And actually, the neoliberals never really wanted to create a true free market system. They never wanted to impose competition on everyone. They wanted to impose really, really ruthless competition on the vast majority of us and force us to compete with each other instead of cooperating, as we had been through the labor movement, through protest movements. But those at the top, they wanted to completely insulate from competition. They didn't want to have to put up with this competitive pressure. Instead, they were better able to cooperate with each other to get what they wanted after the neoliberal turn. And that's what this shift was really about. It was the language of free markets being used to enforce competition on the vast majority of people whilst insulating those at the very top.
Yeah, and one of your central points is that, right, under capitalism, it's a hybrid system. There is planning and kind of a free market economy coexisting side by side. But what's happening is that the planning that is conducted is actually conducted in the interest of large corporations, capital, basically. And I found it interesting that you start off not only with a critique of Hayek and the neoliberals, but you also briefly talk about, in the beginning, you talk about, or you critique John Maynard Keynes and his train of thought. What's your argument there? Why do you go against him? Of course, many people, and even some people here, kind of believe in Keynesianism as the only way to fight back against neoliberalism.
Yeah, so it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about how we've had this setup of this divide, and this is, a divide between Hayek and Keynes, is the divide between, capitalism and socialism, basically, is the divide between left and right. So this kind of division is really preventing us from understanding the way that capitalism actually works. Both Hayek and Keynes agreed that a capitalist economy requires a certain amount of state intervention to make markets work effectively, right? In their thinking and in reality. They just disagreed as to kind of where that line would be drawn. That's actually something that Keynes wrote to Hayek. He said, I agree with a lot of what you said. I would just disagree about where that line should be drawn between these two, between like the market and the state, sorry. And the Marxist critique is to say that whatever state that you have, whatever politics that you have to kind of manage an economic system that is capitalism, the outcomes within that state will be defined by the balance of class power within that society. So both Hayek and Keynes basically believe that you can create a kind of benevolent elite to manage the economy, to manage society that is insulated from pressure emerging from economics, that's insulated from corruption, that's insulated quite effectively from any form of kind of pressure, be that democratic or otherwise. And you can entrust those bureaucrats, basically, to manage that system in a way that benefits everyone. Now, a Marxist critique of both of those views would be to say that it's completely naive about the way that power works within a capitalist society. If you are a large, powerful multinational corporation of the kind that inevitably emerges over the course of capitalism, then even if you started out with a perfectly, like anti-corrupt state, with a state that was completely insulated from the market, that corporation would use its extensive power over workers, over economic output, over the goods that it was producing, over innovation, how much tax it pays, its environmental impact. It would use all of its very, very extensive power to shift the way that that society actually functions, until you reached a point, the point that we reach now, where you see this kind of fusion between political and economic power, such that it doesn't really make sense to talk of the capitalist state as entirely separate from and able to efficiently regulate an entirely separate capitalist economy. And I usually illustrate this point with an example if you think that would be appropriate.
Yeah, please.
It'll take me a while. Yeah.
Take your time.
Cool. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, the example that I usually use is the example of Boeing. So you might be familiar with Boeing. It's obviously a massive multinational aerospace company. Many of you will have flown in a Boeing plane at some point in your life. You may also have seen that Boeing has been in the news. So there have been strikes by the workforce. Whistleblowers have come forward to attest to a toxic corporate culture. The door of a Boeing plane blew out mid-flight. And this all came on the back of two big disasters that you may remember in 2018 and 19, the Boeing 737 MAX disasters. These took place when two Boeing planes nosedived out of the sky, seemingly inexplicably, killing nearly 350 people in two separate plane crashes. Now, when those crashes occurred, there was a lot of speculation as to what was happening. Boeing tried to blame the pilots, but later investigations revealed that there had been a mechanical failing in the plane. There had been a failure of a piece of software called the MCAS system, basically that caused in both incidents, the nose of the plane to dive out of the sky with like extraordinary force. And this system had been brought into the plane at the late stage of its development in a bid basically to maximize value for shareholders. And Boeing was basically involved at the time in this kind of big corporate transformation. It was trying to cut costs throughout the whole organization and really drive up profits and drive up value for shareholders. So the first thing that they, as any company would do when they're told that they need to maximize value for shareholders, they went after the unions. And so Boeing had previously been a firm that had really had quite good relationships between management and the engineers and the pilots that were flying these planes, and it's kind of lionized engineering expertise and a good relationship between management and labor.
Just a second. We can't hear you very well now. The signal's interrupted. Maybe talk again.
Can you hear me now?
You sound like a robot again.
Oh no. I wonder if it's my Wi-Fi has got out. Let me just check. No, my Wi-Fi is fine. Do I still sound funny?
Yeah, you sound funny. Yeah. Not sure what it is. It sounds like a microphone problem, but you're using the same microphone.
How about if I go like this? Wait.
Yeah, maybe you can switch.
How about now? Is that better?
It's the same.
No. Let me try to. I'll try and connect to my 5G.
Habt ihr denn eine Ahnung, ob das
How about now? Is this any better?
No, it's still the same. We're trying to figure out the problem. Might be the speakers in this room. Can you say something, please? Grace?
Hello, how are we looking at right now? I'll just count to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
nur mit den Speakers oder auch? Ah, okay. Stimmt, ja. Can you speak again? Maybe it's better now.
Yeah, 1, 2,
No,
3, 4.
same.
No?
Perhaps you can log out and come back in again.
I'll try.
Okay, thank you.
How is it now?
Much better, great.
Yeah?
Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay. Let's continue.
Shall I just carry on?
Yeah. Do you know where you were? Should we just?
I was talking about Boeing, right?
Yeah, you're talking about Boeing. Exactly.
Yeah, okay, cool. Right, so, yes, I was talking about the transformation of Boeing, going to war with the unions in a maximized value for shareholders. And at that time...
Now we're back to funny sound.
Oh, yeah, I can hear it. Oh, no. I don't know what to do.
The team is trying to figure it out real fast.
Okay. Is it like still sounding really weird, like right now? Oh no, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
Well, someone in the room just said they're just gonna read the book then instead of listening to you, which I think is the intended purpose of this night. So.
I just say that I know you're the bits and everything, and so I'm sorry to repeat that. If you have any questions that you are saving up and really want to ask me, I'm going to get a chance.
Okay, I think the audience can't actually hear you, but
If you just say I will, and I really want to ask this question, just send me a message and I will immediately reply.
yeah, I think the audience couldn't really hear that. But what Grace was saying is that if you have any questions, you can send them to her. So she can explain further, but I hope that we can resolve the speaker issue at some point, because we haven't gotten to the most important part yet.
I know.
Which is what to do against all of this.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, we're gonna try a different cable now.
Okay.
Grace, can you try to speak?
Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay,
5,
that's
6.
better.
Is that better?
Yeah. Very clean, but now you're not as... The volume is down a bit, but... Okay.
Oh, okay. Let me. I can turn the volume up.
Yeah, but now the volume's too low, right?
How about now? Is that better?
Okay, try
Is that
again.
any better? Because I turned the volume up.
Same issue. As soon as we
Same
turn the
issue.
volume up, it
It starts
breaks.
flipping out.
Okay, we're trying out different volume dials now.
Okay, I've turned it down slightly. How is it now?
Now it's good.
Yeah?
Yeah, now it's better again. Okay.
Okay. Should we risk it and try?
Yeah, let's try. Now it's good.
Okay, right. Let's try. I'm going to try and get through this story now much quicker than I was going to before. I'm just going to give you much more information. So you're just going to have to trust me. And like someone in the audience says, you can also read the book if you want the full thing. So look, Boeing 737 MAX disasters killed 350 people. In the investigations that followed, it was basically revealed that Boeing executives had known that they had manufactured an unsafe plane, that there were parts in the plane, particularly this MCAS system that I'd mentioned, that didn't work properly, and that senior people in the company had known about that. But not only had senior people in the company known about that, the regulator had known about it too. So the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, at the time of these disasters was being managed according to a philosophy of self-regulation, which you may be familiar with because it's the same philosophy that underpinned how the banks were being regulated before 2008. And the idea was that no aerospace company would ever manufacture an unsafe plane because doing so would be hurt by their competition. But obviously that didn't happen because a company like Boeing, a massive multinational corporation that does not exist in a free market, it doesn't have any real competition. There's Boeing and then there's Airbus, and they barely compete with each other over price. Instead, they basically work to maximize their profits, and this is exactly what we saw with Boeing, by crushing workers, by cutting costs with the effect of making unsafe planes, and by developing really close relationships with government. And that relationship between Boeing and the American state is so deep and so profound and goes back such a long time. I talk about it in my book, and I was going to explain it all to you now, but I actually think it would take too long to really explain how deep those links are. Suffice to say that when those two plane crashes happened, Boeing was the biggest recipient of corporate welfare in the US. So it was getting tons of money in tax breaks, subsidies, support from local government. It had tons of government contracts. It was an integral part, it still is, of the military-industrial complex in the US. And then even after Boeing was found in the courts to have committed a criminal conspiracy to defraud the United States, even after that, it still got another bailout during the pandemic. it still gets extensive state support. You know, people from the top of Boeing have gone to have senior roles within the US state. This idea that Elon Musk is the first corporate executive to go into the American state and try to promote his own interests is completely absurd. You know, who did Trump make Secretary of State in his first term? It was Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, right? So this is very, very, very clear and very obvious. But in the case of Boeing, it's really exposed the way in which the individuals at the top of these corporations and the top of the American state are working together, are cooperating to pursue their own interests at any cost, and that the mechanisms that are supposed to exist to hold them to account just are not working anymore.
And that's where we get back to your whole argument about planning, right? You're saying that planning does actually take place, and what you're saying now about Boeing is one of the examples, or one way that we can see that planning is actually taking place under capitalism. And I want to get to that central question a bit more, right? Like, to what extent does planning take place under capitalism? Who does the planning? And in whose interest? Of course, now these are very big questions that you kind of answer at length in your book, but maybe you can talk a bit about that extent of planning and why it's important to look at that, to understand that planning is actually taking place.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think this speaks to this kind of question of capitalism isn't a free market system, so what's the alternative, right? And historically, the idea has been that, you know, capitalism is a free market system, the alternative is centralized planning. Why did that emerge as an alternative? Basically, you know, this was the Keynesian idea that the problem with free markets is that they're chaotic. You get periodic financial crises, you get economic crises. But if you had a powerful centralized state, then it could plan economic activity so that the market wasn't so irrational, so that, you know, everyone could have a job all the time, that things would like run a bit smoother. And that's the kind of system that we had in many advanced economies in the wake of the Second World War. But we didn't get to that system because those at the top of society suddenly realized that having a little bit more economic, like centralized planning was a good idea. We got there because there was a movement that fought for that. You know, Keynesianism was a political ideology, the foundation of which was social democracy and the labor movement, right? So workers fought for the implementation of policies like full employment, which was a Keynesian idea, like, you know, rights for workers. The idea of the government stepping in to tame the ups and downs of the business cycle, providing a basic level of subsistence for everyone. These were things that, you know, Keynesian ideas, but they only were implemented because workers fought for them. They organized and demanded that this system would be changed. And that's really the whole issue with the Keynesian narrative when it's divorced from class power. Because the capitalist state is not just going to turn around and do the things that we would want it to do just because we make that demand. You know, this whole idea that, like, I really have always found it really funny that people associate the left with this idea of a big, powerful state doing lots of things for people. Because Marx was, you know, the first person to write that the capitalist state is nothing but a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie. Marx had very little faith in the ability of the capitalist state to tame this market system. And actually the alternative to that kind of like centralized planning, where one state or one corporation or a state working in collaboration with a corporation, the alternative to the idea of these institutions working together to plan society for everyone else is everyone else working together to get to plan their own lives. So you have oligarchic capitalist planning on the one hand, and then decentralized democratic socialist planning on the other hand. And, you know, this is the idea that ordinary people should be able to run the enterprises in which they worked, that people would be able to come together and run this system democratically, socially, collectively, much better than any one or two individuals at the top of any big institution, be that a multinational corporation or a big government. And there's a story that I think is really interesting parallel to that of Boeing, which illustrates this point really clearly. And it's the story of the Lucas plan. So, you know, back in the 1970s, there was another aerospace company called Lucas Aerospace that operated in the UK. and it was being undermined by international competition. Workers were concerned about losing their jobs. So they went to the Labour government and said, can we have a bailout? We need you to nationalise us. And one of the ministers in that government, Tony Benn, who is a personal hero of mine, he's an actual socialist, said, look, we can't actually nationalise you. There were lots of economic problems at the time, but that's not actually going to be the best way probably for you to escape these problems. So why don't you guys go away and come up with a plan as to how you could transform this company, how you could make it viable again. So the unionists went away and they went to the workers at Lucas Aerospace, thousands of them, and they said, what do you think we should do with this company if we have the capacity to take it over and change it? And the response they got was astonishing. They got ordinary workers, engineers, managers from across the company replying, basically all saying, we don't want to produce weapons anymore, which is what they had been doing up to that point. We have the skills and expertise that we believe could be used for the betterment of our society. We want to produce socially useful technologies, and we want to do it democratically, where we're all in charge of what's going on. We get to be part of the decision-making process that governs this firm. And all these ideas came together. They were ideas about how resources could be used with firm to produce wind turbines, to produce kidney dialysis machines, all sorts of useful progressive technologies. And these ideas came together in the form of the Lucas Plan. And this was a kind of lightning rod in British society at the time. This was the 1970s, a time of profound class conflict. And then suddenly this document comes in saying, well, actually, there's something beyond this battle between the market and the state. And that's the interests and views and the capabilities and talents of ordinary people who are saying, if you give us power, we could run this economy, this society, far better than any of you could. And that's the idea of democratic planning as counterposed to the centralized planning that is practiced basically in all current societies, whether they call themselves socialist or a market economy or the social market economy or a capitalist economy. They're all united by the fact that a very small number of people get to control the lives of almost everyone else. And that is the thing that everyone right now, so many people on left and right, are rebelling against.
I found this a beautiful example, but I had kind of two issues with it. One issue is that, well, it's an individual incident and it actually didn't work out because I think the managers ended up kind of not allowing this democratic plan to actually be pursued. So it's this individual incident, and I'm wondering how could we actually create a society where that doesn't just happen on an individual scale, right? How do you bring that up to scale, that kind of idea? How do you make all sorts of corporations within a society make that shift?
Yeah, so look, I think it's really important to understand the context in which this plan failed, because it tells you everything about what neoliberalism was really about. So, you know, we had this incredible plan that was put together. Even the Financial Times, by the way, had praised this plan at Lucas Aerospace. And for a while, it looked like it was going to work. The workers were fighting for it. People were fighting for it in Parliament. And then came 1979, and Margaret Thatcher was elected. Thatcher's whole ideology was that people want a small state, that we need to return to the roots of free market capitalism, which means focusing on individual freedom, reducing the state, more competition. But what Thatcher actually did had nothing to do with any of those things. It wasn't about restoring free markets. It wasn't about restoring personal freedom. Instead, she did, as most ardent free market capitalists do, she used the power of the state to boost her allies and crush her enemies. We saw this very clearly with the labour movement and the miners' strikes, but it also applied to the Lucas Plan. So after Thatcher got into power, the Lucas Plan was shredded. Many of the people who were involved in that plan went to work for the Greater London Council, which was a local government that was kind of a hotbed of socialist organising at the time. What did Thatcher do to the Greater London Council? She destroyed it just a few years later because it had become this hub of resistance to her model. There was even, the Lucas Plan inspired a democratic plan for how the people could take over the area of the London Docklands, which is now the hub of global financialized capitalism. It is a privately owned piece of land within the center of London that hosts some of the largest financial institutions in the world. But at the time, there was a challenge. The people in that area submitted the People's Plan for the London Docklands. And they said, we want control over our place, inspired by what happened at Lucas Aerospace, because we believe that our children deserve better than to be lavatory attendants for passing businessmen. That plan was crushed by Thatcher as well. So what happens with the re-emergence of this free market movement, this movement that was spearheaded based on the idea that human freedom is all important? All of these people that have been putting together plans as to how they could reclaim their freedom from this oppression that they were experiencing at the hands of the state of big business, they were crushed. And this is the interesting thing that I found out in my research. Lucas Aerospace was sold off. It was chopped up into little pieces in the shareholder value revolution of the 1980s. And part of what was once Lucas Aerospace ended up being bought by the company that produced the faulty input for the Boeing 737 MAX plane that crashed all those decades later. I think that really illustrates what this divide is all about. You know, we got to this fork in the road in the 1970s when in some ways the power of the labor movement was at its height. And we were presented with this lie, which was you can choose the market or you can choose the state. And that's not what we were choosing between. We were choosing between centralized oligarchic authority that is exerted over society by a small class of people within both the public and private sector, and democratic collective power of the kind that brings us things like the Lucas Plan, like the People's Plan for the London Docklands. Like there's tons of other examples that I can give you that have been inspired by these movements. Even right now in Italy, there's a factory sit-in in the GKN factory that's going on right now, inspired by the same sort of thing as that which inspired Lucas Aerospace. Across Argentina, there's the factory reclamation movement, which has spread to lots of different parts of South America as well. And, you know, it really illustrates, as I said, this kind of choice that we were faced with between capitalist oligarchy and democratic socialist planning. And of course, capitalist oligarchy won, right? That's why we live today in a society in which a billionaire runs the most powerful government on the planet. But it didn't have to win. It won because we accepted the lies that we were told about the need for free markets, about how we have to compete with each other, about how, you know, we're all on our own and we're all isolated individuals and we can't possibly collaborate in order to kind of change this system. The fact that we accepted those ideas is why we're in the situation that we're in today. And if we want to change things, those are the ideas we need to challenge.
Yeah, and then Keynesian economists or people who generally believe in reform, they would argue, well, that's all nice to think about, but it's simply not possible because capitalism simply is too strong. We can't just enforce such a major shift. What would you respond to that? What are the really kind of practical ways that we could enforce these ideas of democratic planning as opposed to authoritarian planning and as opposed to capitalist planning on a large scale? What would be the practical steps to kind of spread this idea and not just spread the idea, but also enforce it?
Well, they're right. You know, we are in no position to be able to enforce any transformation of capitalism right now because we don't have the power. You know, and there's this big question, right, as to who is the we. We don't live in a society of we's. We live in a society of I's, right? That is the big thing that we need to overcome if we're going to be able to build a movement of the kind that would be able to transform this system. And the only way that we can do that is, as I said, fighting back against this ideology that convinces us that we're all alone, that we're all isolated, that we're all separate from each other, and that there's no point in collaborating and cooperating in order to try to change things. And that's really been the main triumph of neoliberalism, is to crush all forms of collective power and to really undermine the idea that collective power is even important or is even possible. So before we even get to the point of being able to suggest any form of transformation, if we're going to take down Donald Trump, if you're going to fight the AfD, if we're going to fight reform in the UK, if we're going to build a kind of different way of organizing the economy, the first thing that any of us has to do is figure out a way of fighting, cutting through this individualistic consciousness that I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, which generates this powerlessness, which forces us all to confront this broken system and either give in to despair or give in to rage. And that's what happens when you confront a broken system and you are completely and utterly on your own and you feel like there's nothing that you could do with others to change it. And you ask for practical examples. And every single week I write a column called What Can We Do?, which basically interviews a different person from a different part of the movement about what they are doing to cut through individualism and build collective movements. Last week, I interviewed federal workers who are organizing in the American state to resist Trump and Musk. And they formed a new union that is bringing people out onto the streets to protest, as well as resisting the cuts that are being imposed on federal workers within the US state. The week before that, I spoke to students in Serbia who have organized some of the biggest protests that have ever been seen in that country against government corruption and are basically nearly bringing down the government. The week before that, I spoke to an environmentalist organization within the UK called Green New Deal Rising that has launched a coordinated campaign to end the renewal of oil and gas licenses in the UK by the government, and has launched a number of different challenges as to how they're going to do that. I spoke to a trade unionist organization that is providing political education to workers about how capitalism works and radicalizing them to grow and expand the union on that basis. I spoke to an organizer in New Orleans who during the pandemic saw the explosion of homelessness on her streets and set up an organization called Southern Solidarity, which draws on the tradition of the Black Panthers and the civil rights movement to say we're going to organize homeless people in this area and we're going to support each other through this idea of solidarity, not just us giving them charity. I've got literally like dozens and dozens of examples as to how you could begin to organize in your workplace, organize in your community, organize on the streets, start a movement. And there's so many examples of this happening all over the world right now. And there's lots in my book, there's lots on my Substack. So yeah.
And one thing I kept thinking about, it's one thing that you didn't mention now, because you're saying the biggest threat to democratic planning isn't the power of capitalism or the power of capitalists, but actually the fact that so many people just can't even imagine that it's possible to do democratic planning. And one thing that I kept thinking is that we really lack these visions or kind of stories or films about how that could actually look like. We just don't know, and we're not presented with these ideas. Growing up in capitalist systems, of course, you don't get to see that in school or in university or whatever media you consume. Isn't that also one of the biggest problems now, that we can't even imagine, right? We can't even imagine a world outside of this capitalist system.
Yeah, 100%. That's capitalist realism. But the only way to cut through that is to expose people to the reality of what they can achieve if they organize. You can't just tell people if you organize, things are going to be better. That has to be something that people experience in like a real, embodied, lived way. And I think part of the route into that, and this is what my next book is going to be about, is saying, why do we live in a society in which so many people are suffering with such profound mental ill health? Why do we live in a society in which people feel so desperately alone, feel so isolated, feel so despairing? It's because we have lost our sense of agency. We've lost our sense of how we can fight back against the forces that are basically crushing us, and showing people that, through loads of examples, loads of interviews, that as soon as you take the step of participating in a movement, whether that's the labor movement, whether it's a tenants movement, whether it's community organizing, whether it's literally going down and saving your local library from being shut down, you experience a radical sense of collective joy and of collective power that is impossible to stamp out once it has been lit up in someone. And that is what gives me all of the hope in the world for the future, because it's happening everywhere.
And what happens, so you're saying right now we're lacking power to actually change the system on a larger scale, and the first thing that needs to be done is kind of cutting through this individualism. But what's the next step after that? Once we've kind of managed, maybe in our area or in our community, to cut through that and actually organize, what's the next step?
Well, I mean, that comes out of the movement, right? If it was a centrally imposed plan as to what the next step would be, then it wouldn't really be democratic planning. You know, the way that society is designed emerges from these movements and these demands for social and economic transformation. If we have powerful collective movements, then they'll be able to articulate demands as to how we should reorganize society. And, you know, if we look back to the history of most of these movements as they've existed throughout time and space, it has been generally pretty simple demands, like people should be able to live, inequality shouldn't be too high, the climate should be protected, and the foundations of our life, of human life, and of the natural world upon which we rely should be cherished and stewarded rather than exploited for profit. And that looks differently in different times, in different places, in different spaces, in different cultures. But those demands emerge from the process of struggle. They aren't imposed from the outside by intellectuals.
Thank you so much. Before I open to the discussion, I want to, unfortunately, this was such a nice moment now. Now I have to bring us back to the very sad reality. I want to talk to you about the most kind of important economic happening right now, of course, Trump's tariff policy, because it's really important, I think, in understanding the global economic moment we're at right now. What do you make of it? Of course, everyone's talking about it, and then there's some people who would say, well, Trump is just an idiot. He doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know economics. And then the others, like Richard Wolff, for example, say, no, actually there's this great plan. What he's doing is the empire is falling, and he's trying to kind of have a system or put up a system that benefits those close around him. What do you make of it?
Yeah, so look, the answer to this question doesn't lie in the realm of economics, it lies in the realm of politics. Trump's policy agenda isn't about growing the US economy, it's about defending America's declining position in the capitalist world system. So it's about preserving US hegemony, even if that means sacrificing prosperity. So he's justified this trade war by claiming that the current system of global trade harms the interests of US workers, pointing to the devastation of industrial communities across the Midwest, which have been hollowed out by decades of offshoring and globalization. And he claims that tariffs will force companies to reshore production and create jobs for American workers. Now, there is obviously a grain of truth to that. Neoliberal globalization has been a disaster for much of the US working class. And both of the major political parties completely ignored that for, basically the last several decades. But tariffs alone aren't going to bring back the jobs lost to globalization over the last 40 years. And it's not even what Trump really wants. He was never really concerned about the interests of American workers. He spent 4 years crushing unions, slashing taxes for the wealthy, rolling back labor protections. His rhetorical appeal to the interests of working class communities disguises the real plan, which is weaponizing the US economy to arrest the imperial decline of the US. So the US has ruled the capitalist world system since the end of the Second World War. It's dominated through its control of the finance, trade, tech, all backed up by the world's most formidable military. And this dominance allowed it to set the rules of world trade to the benefit of US capital. But US hegemony has been in decline for a while now. Its share of GDP has fallen. The dollar's dominance is being eroded. Countries like Russia and China have started to trade outside the dollar system. Competitors have long since taken over the US's role as the world's manufacturing powerhouse. And the EU is pushing for strategic autonomy in a number of sectors, including tech and defense. So Trump's tariffs are a response to this decline. He's attempting to basically weaponize the size of the US economy and its importance to global trade to discipline his allies and his rivals in order to force other nations to accept his terms or risk being locked out. So they're much less about economics and much more about politics. They're kind of a form of economic war, And it's like a war against the system that the US itself built after 1945. He's kind of started to say the quiet part out loud, really, because for a long time, US leaders have claimed to support free markets and free trade, but actually they use the language of freedom to hide a system of imperial dominance. So, you know, whether that was the imposition of structural adjustment on the global south, trade agreements like NAFTA, investor-state dispute settlements, you know, the bailouts for Wall Street, thanks to the rise of the dollar-based financial system. Trump's now just dropped all that rhetoric, and he states outright that he's not interested in free trade, which obviously we know that none of these politicians really are. He doesn't care about the impact his tariffs have on markets. He wants control over supply chains, control over capital flows, control over the behavior of rival states. And he's willing to kind of crash the economy to get that. And it tells us a broader lesson about how capitalism works, because the goal of the capitalist state is not to deliver prosperity for all. It's to maintain order, protect property, and preserve the dominance of capital at home and abroad. And the power of capital is what makes the system go around, because no company can make profits if workers don't submit to their own exploitation, and no government can rule properly if citizens don't obey in advance. So that's why governments often make decisions that seem irrational from the perspective of the academic economist. They're not serving the economy, they're protecting and expanding their own power. And Trump's tariffs is a case in point.
And would you say that there's a, just really the last question, would you say there's a hope in people waking up to that fact now? Because it's kind of becoming so obvious that the working class is not benefiting from these policies at the moment, and probably will never benefit from them.
Yeah, what Trump's done is politicize the economy, right? You know, we've had a long time of this discourse, which is, don't ask questions about the economy. The experts are in charge, and we're making these decisions based on a set of economic principles that you can never claim to understand. So don't ask any questions. Whereas Trump is very clearly acting from politics. He's making political decisions that have distributive consequences about the economy. So that would lead to the conclusion amongst some people that if Trump can destroy the world economy to pursue his particular interest in politics, then why is it not impossible to do things like, in the US, Medicare for all? Why is it impossible to invest in public services? Why is it impossible to have a minimum wage? Why is it impossible to tax corporations? Any of those demands could not have even a tenth of the impact on the US economy that Trump has had over the last several months, and yet they're impossible. So this creates a big crack in this ideology that justifies this whole system. And in that sense, it could be an opportunity. Unfortunately, it's an opportunity that the Democratic Party is definitely not going to take, because it is one of the most obviously captured and corrupt left-wing political parties in the Western world. The question is, can someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders come in and shake it up enough, build enough power outside of that party to force them to do something different? And I don't know, I'm hopeful as ever.
Yeah, and then the problem is that they're not really acting outside of the party really, right? But sorry, I didn't want to crush your hopeful.
But, you know, if they're going to be able to gain any power within the Democratic Party, then they need to be able to build power outside of that party to force those leaders of the Democrats to listen. You know, this was the same thing as what we had with like Corbynism in the UK. Like the fear of those leaders in the upper echelons of that party structure was that there was too much popular power. There were too many members in the Labour Party, which undermined their authority over the decision-making process. So building up popular power in the way that they're trying to do right now is the prerequisite to doing anything progressive within a political party like the Democrats. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will happen, but if you don't build up that popular power, then it definitely won't happen.
Yeah, okay, that's a good note to end on, I think. And now I want to open up the discussion to the audience. So both the audience in the room, but I think also people who are joining us online can submit questions, right? No, they can't. No democratic participation here.
As I said before, guys, if you don't get the chance to ask a question, I feel really bad that I'm not there. So please just message me on Instagram or Substack or Blue Sky or anything, and I will respond to your questions in person if you can't ask them now.
Okay, let's start with the first question.
Yeah, I have a question to you.
To me.
Because you mentioned the working class, and I was thinking, like, there is no working class. Aren't we all working, like all the people on planet Earth? Maybe you want to, I don't know, answer that? Maybe you can.
Well, I think there are different ways that one could define. Did you hear the question, Grace?
Yeah. I'm happy to answer it as well, but you
okay,
go ahead.
yeah. I mean, I think you're more qualified to answer than me. I have things to say, but I think you could answer it way better than me.
Okay, well, I'll say what I think, and then you can say what you think if you want. My answer to the question stems from my ideological framework, which is Marxism. And Marxism is a system that categorizes classes based on relations of production. So a capitalist is someone who owns means of production. There's someone who owns the things that we need to survive. A worker has to sell their labor power for a living. Now, that is a divide that is more about understanding the dynamics of capital accumulation than pinpointing an individual's position in a class structure. You have to understand that divide to be able to understand how capitalism works, to be able to understand the profit motive, exploitation, to understand the centralization, concentration of capital, all of these really important points. And that is, but it's like, it's a heuristic. So it's not intended to be an exhaustive description of the class system. So you can bring into that things like, right, okay, well, Marx obviously noted that there are managers within this system. There's a class of management that manages the production process on behalf of those at the top. And we see, for example, in the rich world that we have economies that have specialized in the management of a globalized production process. So we have an owning class that exists largely in the US and across Western Europe. We have a managerial class that manages a globalized production process. And that's, sales, finance, accounting, all these sorts of professional services that are basically about managing the flows of goods and products all around the world. And then you have a huge working class concentrated in the global south, making all the goods the rest of us needs to survive. And then you have a class that is kind of excluded from capitalist social relations altogether because they can't get work and they're unable to basically participate in those systems. So they're still relying on basically subsistence agriculture and like small forms of wage labor every now and again. And that really like defines the divide that we're seeing. It's like a big working class concentrated in the global south, a huge class of people who are living in basically extreme poverty, unable to earn a wage, a small class of kind of professional managers existing across the rich world, and a tiny, tiny class of wealthy owners. And, that's not going to give you it doesn't tell you like how posh someone is or like what their class background is or any of that sort of stuff. But it does tell you the structure of global capitalism.
Yeah, and I think what also really helped me understand, right, because I think the point that he's trying to make is that, of course, there are divisions within the working class, right, and sometimes even so strongly that a person that we would consider traditional working class doesn't even encounter people, let's say, who are still like engaging in wage labor, but they don't, but they get paid a lot, and they kind of belong to a different class socially and also in their habitus. And I think what was very important to me to understand these divisions and that in the end they kind of come back together is, I think you're already kind of drawing on that, is Nancy Fraser's idea of the different kinds of exploitation that we see within the capitalist system, right? You have the kind of normal wage labor exploitation, I wouldn't call it normal, but that we see here in the West, of kind of regular people engaging in wage labor, and of course they're being exploited, but not as much exploited other people who actually engage or are forced into slave labor, especially in the global south. So you have different levels of like exploitation, but in the end they still come back to that same class dynamic where some people own everything, are in control of the means of production, and then there are other people who kind of have some kind of, either they have some choices in what kind of wage labor they engage in, or they don't have a choice at all. They have to kind of slave away. That's especially the case in the global south. Has this answered your question a bit? He's not fully satisfied. Yeah.
Wait. If you want to continue, another question, you need the microphone. No.
Okay. Next question.
Hi, Grace. Max here. Thanks so much. So one of the things that keeps coming up is that on the left we need a new narrative, a new paradigm, a new political consensus. I'm sure you've seen this kind of sort of language. So Naomi Klein was writing this like 10 years ago already, saying we need a new narrative to sort of pull together these different examples from Italy, from Argentina. And my question is, do you agree with that? Would it help? Where could it come from? In my free time, I sometimes try to look for one, and it's very hard to find anyone actually working on a compelling, new narrative, new paradigm. So yeah, any thoughts on where that could come from would be great. Thanks.
Sure. I mean, I would say I don't think we need a new narrative at all. I think we need popular engagement. I read a book recently called Don't Talk About Politics, and it produced some fascinating evidence about how a culture of political debate changes almost no one's minds, because it is extremely difficult to change someone's political beliefs, which are attached to their identity, through argumentation and debate and kind of logical, rational reasoning, basically. If you want to change people's minds, that is a process that requires building trust, listening, engaging, and then a steady process of transformation. And that is, of course, how working class political movements have been built throughout history. It hasn't been through like an intelligent intellectual swooping into a community and saying, have you guys considered maybe organizing to try and get a higher wage? It was because a couple of people came together, formed a union, and expanded and grew that union by talking to other people in their workplace, talking to people in their community, building out that movement and engaging people through one-to-one conversations and through that process of organizing. And that process of organizing proved that worked, that can make your life better. And so it became embedded. And that's really how left politics emerged. It emerged out of people's struggles for a better life, not a kind of overarching narrative that was produced by anyone, really. So I don't necessarily think we need a new narrative. I think we need to encourage people to form their own narratives collectively by engaging in projects to protect themselves, protect their communities, and demand a fairer society.
And how do we do that, right? Like, where to start with that? Because when I think of, okay, I want my society to understand these dynamics and to go and start these collective processes, I think, where could you do that? You could do that through education, you could do that through school, but of course our education teaches us different things. And that would be another kind of authoritarianism, right? Like saying the state should educate people to engage in democratic socialism. Of course, that's not what you envision. But how can we kind of practically make that happen? How can we practically make our communities change or shift their way of thinking about these things?
Again, we can't do anything to make anyone change their way of doing anything, right? Like if you want to go out and try and build a better society, there are very clear and obvious ways that you as a person are going to be able to do that. By organizing alongside other people. That could be in your workplace. You could decide you're going to form a union. It could be in your community. You could form a tenants union. You could form a community organizing network. You could join ACORN, which is a community union. You could participate in, various different forms of kind of collective action at the local level, like, for example, There's been all sorts of actions that have taken place recently to stop deportations in the UK, to stop people being kicked out of their houses by rogue landlords. You could, go in completely the other direction and decide, I want to join a political party and I maybe want to stand for office because I think that's something that I could do. I want to become a policy development person and join a think tank and develop policy ideas. I want to become a political communicator and, go on TV and start talking about these ideas because I, really care about them and think about them. There are so many different ways in for everyone. And I think that, everyone needs to figure out that thing on their own. I'm really anti the dogmatic position, which is to say that there is one route to acquiring the right political philosophy. I
totally
just think that's completely anti our politics.
I totally see your point, but I also see a problem that, right, that's again kind of a very individualistic approach to say that everyone should just kind of individually go and find their way to participate. I agree with the idea, but the problem is that what we're fighting against, or all of us individually are fighting against, or up against, is a system that doesn't only run the way it is materially, but also spreads propaganda kind of the whole time about how our society functions. And we've talked about some of these propaganda narratives, right? Like you're this individual fighter who needs to who needs to rise up in the ranks of whatever capitalism. But then, isn't that kind of how could we fight against that by just?
You need a political party, right? Yeah, if you want to take over the state, you need a political party. So how do you form a political party in a world of isolated, disengaged people who have no experience of collective action? You don't. There's no left in any of our societies. There are no left parties. So where do you start? You have to create informed, engaged citizens who understand the importance of collective action so that they are able to then take that fight into politics. Because it's all very well, I could just sit here and say to you, well, ultimately, the socialist revolution requires us to have a vanguard party that is informed by Marxist theory, and these are the steps that we need to achieve in order to get there. But it would just be meaningless nonsense because we're so far away from that point. Because we don't have the party, we don't have the leaders, we don't have the informed citizenry, we don't have the people who are required to go in and fight that fight. So what I'm saying is, we're back here. It's literally about creating a group of people, a society, who understand the need to work together to change things. That's literally the thing that we need to be focusing on right now. If we're going to be able to do any of those future steps around forming parties, around taking control of the means of production, taking control of the state, any of that stuff, the biggest thing that stands in the way of doing that is our isolation from each other. That's what we need to cut through. That's the first step, which is why I think all of these kind of individualistic sounding routes into political organizing are important, because it is about cutting through the thing that keeps the system going, which is capitalist realism. It's the idea that everything's broken, but there is no alternative. And people believe there's no alternative because they're isolated, divided, and on their own.
Are there any further questions or anything that you would like to discuss here? No, there's silence. Nobody wants to discuss this further.
Stunned silence.
You wanna? Oh no. Okay. Okay. Yeah. There are no further questions. You were saying that people could actually reach you to ask questions if they have any further questions, maybe after they've read your book. How can they reach you?
You can message me on any of the big social media sites except X that I don't really use anymore. You can look at my Substack, which involves all these interviews I've been speaking about. It's called What Can We Do? And I interview a different person from a different part of the movement every week to talk about what they are actually doing in their community, in their workplace, in their politics, whatever. And those, I think, are quite helpful if you're wondering, what can I do and how can I get involved? So yeah, Instagram, Substack, Blue Sky, whatever, message me and I will get back to you.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today and for talking about your book and also your upcoming book. When will it be available?
I'm writing it right now.
You're still writing it.
It's probably not going to be out for the next several years.
Okay, it sounded as if you're almost done.
Stages of research.
Okay.
Yeah, I know,
Right.
right? It sounds that way. It has to, for me to be able to sell it to a publisher. I have to convince them that I know everything that's going to be in it, even though I'm actually researching and talking to people, and I'm being led towards these conclusions by them as much as the other way around.
Yeah, well, that's how that industry works, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is.
Well, then we still have time to read this book. And we're looking forward to hearing more from you once your next book is out. Thank you so much. It's such a pity that you couldn't actually join us in person today. It was still great having you.
I'm really sad not to be there to enjoy what is apparently a beautiful day in Berlin, something I haven't experienced in quite some time.
Yeah, but then maybe you'd regret having to be inside and not outside.
True, yes.
And
so I appreciate you all being here despite the lovely weather.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone who joined us today in person and everyone who joined us online despite the weather and despite Grace not being able to be here. And we hope to welcome you back in Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung for the next event that's part of Linksbündig. Thank you so much and have a good night. And I hope you get to enjoy the good weather.